It's easy today, sitting with decades of hindsight, to picture the P-51 Mustang as an instant classic, an aircraft that was always destined to be the long-range guardian of American bombers and the scourge of the Luftwaffe. But that isn't the truth. The truth is far more complicated, and far more revealing about how technology, timing, and decision-making intersect in wartime. The bold claim is this: the first P-51 Mustang was a failure at the very mission that eventually made it famous, high-altitude escort. And the reason was not its airframe, not its aerodynamics, not even its range. The reason was its heart, the Allison V-1710 engine. In the spring of 1940, Europe was on fire. Britain, desperate for modern fighters to replace losses from the Battle of France and looming Battle of Britain, was buying anything it could from American industry. The British Purchasing Commission approached North American Aviation, NAA, with an idea. Could NAA build Curtiss P-40 Warhawks under license? It would have been a safe, predictable choice. But James Dutch Kindleberger, the hard-charging president of NAA, convinced the British that his company could design and deliver an entirely new fighter in the same time it would take to simply set up a P-40 production line. It was a bold promise, almost reckless. But NAA delivered. In just 117 days, the prototype NA-73X rolled out. Its lines were sleek, its wing based on the new laminar flow concept being tested by NACA. The fuselage was compact, the radiator scoop ingeniously designed to reduce drag and even provide a bit of thrust thanks to what later became known as the Meredith effect. The plane looked like the future. Test pilots praised its handling. On paper, the Mustang was something special. But paper doesn't win air battles. Engines do. And that's where the story turns. The Allison V-1710 was, in many ways, a fine engine. It was a 12-cylinder liquid-cooled V-type, rugged, relatively simple, and capable of producing over 1,000 horsepower. American engineers had been working with the Allison for years. It powered the P-38 Lightning, the early P-40s, and several experimental aircraft. At low altitudes, say below 15,000 feet, it was lively, smooth, and competitive. But the version installed in the first Mustangs came with a single-stage, single-speed supercharger. That meant it could not keep pumping dense enough air into the cylinders as altitude climbed. Above 15,000 feet, horsepower fell off a cliff. At 20,000 feet, the Mustang with an Allison was anemic. At 25,000 feet, the altitude where American B-17 bombers flew, it was practically gasping for breath. This wasn't some minor flaw. It was catastrophic for the exact mission that mattered most. The Royal Air Force, which received the first Mustangs as the Mustang Mki, quickly realized this. British pilots adored the airplane down low. In tactical reconnaissance and ground attack roles, it was fast, stable, and carried heavy armament. It could dive on German convoys in France, zip across the Channel, and fight off enemy patrols under 15,000 feet with ease. But when the RAF tried to use it as a true interceptor or high-altitude escort, disappointment followed. Luftwaffe fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf FW 190, equipped with advanced superchargers and tuned for the thinner air, easily outclimbed and outmaneuvered the Allison Mustang above 20,000 feet. The Mustang's beautiful wing and slippery fuselage simply couldn't make up for an engine that was starving for oxygen. To understand why, we need to step into the technical weeds for a moment. A supercharger's job is to compress incoming air so that even in thin, high-altitude conditions, the engine cylinders receive enough oxygen molecules for efficient combustion. The Allison's single-stage supercharger was like a pump with only one gear. It worked decently at lower levels, but as the plane climbed, the pump reached its limits. By contrast, the Rolls-Royce Merlin, used in later Spitfires, had a two-stage, two-speed supercharger. That meant it could adapt as altitude changed, keeping power high even in the thin air over 25,000 feet. The difference was night and day. In real combat, this meant that Allison Mustangs were lions on the deck but lambs in the stratosphere. The Americans didn't immediately grasp how serious this was. At that time, U.S. Army Air Force's doctrine emphasized bombers, self-defending, heavily armed bombers. The belief was that formations of B-17 flying fortresses could penetrate deep into enemy territory without fighter escort. That doctrine would collapse in blood and fire in 1943, but in 1941 and 1942, it seemed plausible. So for the U.S., a Mustang that performed brilliantly at low altitudes still had value for tactical roles. The RAF, however, already had hard experience against German fighters and knew that altitude performance was the difference between life and death. To them, the Allison Mustang was a brilliant airplane hobbled by a mismatched engine. Let's be clear, the Allison Mustang was not a total failure. It carved out a niche as a tactical reconnaissance aircraft. RAF pilots flew it aggressively at treetop levels, strafing trains, attacking airfields, and taking photographic reconnaissance that was critical for Allied planning. American pilots in the P-51A also valued its handling in ground attack roles in the Mediterranean theater. But history does not remember the P-51 as a low-level mud fighter. History remembers it as the long-range, high-altitude escort that finally allowed Allied bombers to strike the heart of Germany in daylight. That role was impossible for the Allison engine versions. So why did North American and the U.S. Army choose the Allison in the first place? Partly it was logistics and timing. In 1940, the Allison V-1710 was available in numbers. It was American-made, supported by existing supply chains, and politically safe. The Merlin was a British engine, and while Rolls-Royce had experience, they didn't have the production capacity to equip large numbers of American aircraft. The Packard-built Merlin was still a future prospect. In the urgent context of 1940, the Allison looked like the practical solution. The irony is that practicality nearly strangled the Mustang's future. The RAF was not willing to give up so easily. British engineers had a knack for tinkering, for testing odd combinations just to see what might happen. At Rolls-Royce's facility at Hucknall, experimental engineers decided to bolt a Merlin into a Mustang airframe. The results were electrifying. Suddenly, the same sleek fuselage that had struggled in thin air was climbing like a rocket. Speed at altitude jumped by 50 to 70 miles per hour. The Mustang, once limited to tactical altitudes, was now a genuine contender in the high-altitude arena. Test pilots raved about the transformation. The RAF quickly pressed for production of Merlin Mustangs, and eventually Packard began building Merlins under license in the United States. The P-51B and later P-51D were born. But that's the story of salvation. Right now, in Section 1, we are still with the Allison Mustang, the nearly was of fighter history. Imagine for a moment being a young RAF pilot in 1942, strapping into this brand new American fighter. The cockpit is snug, the canopy giving you a clean view, the throttle eager in your hand. Down low, skimming the hedgerows of occupied France, the Mustang feels alive. Fast, responsive, lethal with its guns. But then you climb. 15,000 feet. 17. 20. The controls still feel good, but the engine no longer roars, it strains. German contrails appear above you, and as the 109s dive, you know you cannot climb to meet them. You are stuck below, reactive, disadvantaged. That was the bitter truth of the Allison Mustang. It's important to understand that this wasn't incompetence. The engineers at Allison weren't fools. The designers at North American weren't blind. They built to the requirements and realities they were given. No one in 1940 could perfectly predict what 1943 would demand. War moves faster than design cycles. The Allison problem is less a story of technical failure than of timing, doctrine, and luck. Had the air war remained at low altitudes, the Mustang would have been a star from day one. But the war went high, and the Allison could not follow. Yet within this near failure lies the seed of the Mustang's legend. The Allison versions proved the airframe's potential. They showed that this design could be fast, efficient, and stable. They built the case for further investment. And when the Merlin finally arrived, it was like unlocking a cage. The Mustang that history celebrates was born not from a clean slate but from the frustrations of its first, flawed iteration. Without the Allison Mustang's shortcomings, there might never have been the drive to experiment with the Merlin swap. In that sense, the Allison problem was both a curse and a gift. So, when we talk about the Mustang's glory in later years, escorting bombers to Berlin, dueling with the Luftwaffe over Germany, carrying the fight deep into Axis territory, we must remember this: it almost never happened. The first Mustangs failed at the mission that defined the war. They were brilliant but broken, champions that couldn't breathe. And only by recognizing that failure and daring to fix it did the Allies unlock one of the greatest fighters of all time. The Allison Mustang was a beautiful but flawed machine, and by late 1942, its limitations were impossible to ignore. The RAF wanted altitude. The U.S. 8th Air Force, now beginning daylight bombing raids over occupied Europe, wanted altitude. Bomber crews dying in droves over Germany wanted altitude. And yet, the Mustang, sleek and promising, could not deliver it. What happened next is one of the great what-if rescues in aviation history. The decision to transplant a British heart into an American body. The result was the Merlin Mustang, a marriage of engineering that turned near failure into immortal success. The key player in this transformation was the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, an engineering marvel that had already proved itself in the Spitfire and Hurricane during the Battle of Britain. The Merlin wasn't just powerful, it was adaptable. Its two-stage, two-speed supercharger allowed it to breathe at different altitudes, maintaining power where other engines wheezed. The British had learned, through the fires of 1940, that wars were fought upwards, into the cold, thin stratosphere where bombers flew and where survival depended on horsepower at 25,000 feet. They knew the Allison Mustang was being held back by its lungs, not its limbs. So the question became, what if we put a Merlin in it? At Rolls-Royce's experimental facility at Hucknall, that question turned into action. In the summer of 1942, engineers installed a Merlin-61 into a Mustang airframe. The results were immediate and dramatic. The new hybrid leapt skyward. At 20,000 feet, where the Allison had faltered, the Merlin Mustang surged ahead with speeds 50 miles per hour faster than before. At 30,000 feet, where the Allison was practically unusable, the Merlin Mustang was still delivering power, still climbing, still fighting. Test pilots were astonished. One RAF pilot described the difference as like trading a pony for a thoroughbred stallion. This was not just a technical success, it was a strategic revelation. Suddenly, the Mustang wasn't limited to reconnaissance or low-level strikes. Suddenly, it was a contender for the exact role the Allies needed most: a long-range, high-altitude escort fighter. The marriage of the Mustang's efficient airframe and the Merlin's high-altitude performance created something unique: an aircraft that could go farther, faster, and higher than almost anything else in the skies. But making this vision a reality was not simple. Rolls-Royce could not possibly supply Merlins in the numbers required. Britain was already stretched, building Spitfires and Lancasters, each demanding its own share of the Merlin supply. The solution came across the Atlantic in Detroit, Michigan. The Packard Motor Car Company had been licensed to build the Merlin under the designation V1650. Packard had American industrial muscle and precision, and with that, the idea of mass-producing Merlin Mustangs became feasible. What had begun as an experiment in a British test shop was now an industrial partnership that spanned oceans. The first production models, designated P-51B and P-51C, rolled off the lines in 1943. They looked different from their Allison ancestors. The nose was longer, reshaped to accommodate the Merlin's intercooler and supercharger plumbing. The radiator scoop was enlarged and refined. Armament was standardized to 4.50 caliber Browning machine guns in the wings, later upgraded to 6 in the P-51D. Most importantly, performance data told the story. A top speed of over 430 miles per hour, a service ceiling above 40,000 feet, and with external drop tanks, an operational range of nearly 1,000 miles. For the first time, the U.S. Army Air Forces had a fighter that could escort bombers deep into Germany and still fight effectively at altitude. The arrival of the Merlin Mustang coincided with the dark days of 1943, when American bomber losses were reaching unsustainable levels. Missions to Schweinfurt and Regensburg saw B-17 formations shredded by German fighters. Morale among bomber crews was collapsing. The Mustang's timing was almost providential. By early 1944, P-51 BS and CS were entering combat in meaningful numbers, and they immediately changed the dynamic. Pilots who transitioned from the Allison Mustang to the Merlin version were effusive in their praise. Colonel Thomas J. Christian Jr., commander of the 361st Fighter Group, described the Merlin Mustang as the fighter we'd been waiting for. Captain Don Blakesley, who later led the famous 4th Fighter Group, called it a Spitfire with endurance. What they meant was simple. It had the agility and speed of a European thoroughbred, but the fuel capacity and reliability of an American machine. Could dance with the best of the Luftwaffe and still make it home. That combination was priceless. From the perspective of Luftwaffe pilots, the change was terrifying. For years, German fighter commanders had relied on the predictable weakness of Allied escorts. They could only follow the bombers so far, usually not beyond the Rhine. Once the escorts turned back, the bombers were alone, and that was when the Luftwaffe pounced. But the Merlin Mustang shattered that calculus. Suddenly, American fighters were appearing over Berlin itself, still strong, still aggressive, still able to fight. Erich Buby Hartmann, the highest-scoring ace in history, later remarked that the Mustang was the most dangerous Allied fighter he faced. Not because it was unbeatable in a dogfight, but because it was always there, no matter how deep the raid. It's worth pausing here to appreciate the sheer industrial and political complexity of this transformation. The Mustang story is not just about a clever engine swap. It's about Allies sharing technology in ways that were rare and risky. Rolls-Royce had to open its blueprints. Packard had to master British engineering standards while adapting them to American factories. North American had to redesign parts of its production line in the middle of a war. The U.S. Army Air Forces had to admit implicitly that its doctrine about self-defending bombers had been wrong and that long-range escorts were essential. None of this was inevitable. It took vision, cooperation, and stubborn insistence on fixing what had seemed like a fatal flaw. As the Merlin Mustangs spread across Europe in 1944, the results spoke for themselves. Bomber losses dropped. Fighter sweeps pushed deeper into German territory. The Luftwaffe, already strained by fuel shortages and the demands of multiple fronts, began to lose air superiority. Pilots like George Preddy, Bud Anderson, and Chuck Yeager made their names in Merlin Mustangs, racking up kills while escorting bombers over enemy skies. Their stories became legend, but behind those legends was an engine swap that had transformed an aircraft's destiny. The story of the Merlin Mustang also reveals something deeper about wartime innovation. That sometimes the greatest breakthroughs come not from a single genius but from a collaboration across nations and companies. The Mustang was an American airframe. The Merlin was a British design. Packard's V1650 was an American-built version of that British design. The result was not purely American or purely British, but a hybrid that embodied the alliance itself. In a sense, every Merlin Mustang that flew over Europe carried in its fuselage a symbol of Allied cooperation. The idea that survival required pooling the very best of each nation's talents. And yet, the Mustang's transformation was not purely technical. It was also psychological. Bomber crews, who had once counted down the minutes until their escorts had to turn back, now looked out of their windows and saw P-51s still with them, even as Berlin loomed on the horizon. That presence gave hope. Fighter pilots, who had once dreaded climbing into thin air against better-equipped German interceptors, now felt confident that their engine wouldn't betray them. That confidence translated into aggression, and aggression translated into victories. Wars are fought by machines, but they are won by men, and those men fight better when they believe their machine will not let them down. The Merlin Mustang gave them that belief. Looking back, it's tempting to see the Merlin swap as obvious. Of course, the Mustang needed the Merlin. Of course, it became great afterward. But in 1942, it was not obvious. The U.S. Army could have stuck with doctrine. North American could have stayed conservative. Packard could have declined to take on the headache of foreign engineering. Rolls-Royce could have focused only on Spitfires. At every step, this could have failed. The fact that it succeeded is a testament to how desperation, innovation, and cooperation can collide in war to produce miracles. By mid-1944, the P-51D was entering service, with its iconic bubble canopy and 6.50 caliber guns. This was the definitive Mustang, the one etched in memory and museums. But the D model was only possible because of the leap made by the Merlin Mustangs before it. Without Section 2 of this story, the British gamble, the Packard production, the marriage of engine and airframe, the Mustang would never have been more than a footnote. So when we remember the Mustang soaring over Europe, slicing through contrails, outpacing Messerschmitts and escorting fortresses, we must remember the lesson. Greatness was not built into the Mustang at birth. It was earned, salvaged, and engineered through a transatlantic act of boldness. The Allison problem had nearly doomed it. The Merlin solution saved it. By late 1942 and into 1943, the Allison-powered Mustang had already proven itself as a capable low-altitude aircraft, especially in the tactical reconnaissance and ground attack roles. Yet the question still haunted its reputation. Could this sleek, promising fighter ever break free of its low-altitude shackles? For the Army Air Forces, the problem was no longer theoretical, it was urgent. The daylight bombing campaign over Europe was about to escalate, and American bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator would need long-range escort fighters. Without them, the losses were unsustainable. Early trials had shown that P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings could extend some cover, but they lacked the combination of range, maneuverability, and altitude performance that was essential for deep raids into Germany. The Mustang seemed like the perfect candidate, but not in its Allison form. At this point, the focus shifted from North American Aviation's engineers in California to their counterparts across the Atlantic. In Britain, Rolls-Royce had already been experimenting with engine swaps. British test pilots looked at the Mustang's aerodynamic potential and asked a simple but radical question. What if we dropped in the Merlin engine, the same one that powered the Spitfire and Hurricane? The Merlin had already proven its ability to deliver power at altitude with its two-stage, two-speed supercharger system. This was not just an incremental improvement. It was a total transformation. By marrying the Mustang's low-drag laminar flow wing and efficient fuselage to the Merlin's altitude performance, the British saw the possibility of creating a fighter unmatched in reach and capability. The first prototypes with the Merlin were unofficially dubbed Mustang MKX by the British. Test flights in 1942 at Boscombe Down were almost shocking in how dramatically they changed the plane's character. Suddenly, the Mustang leapt from being a ground-hugging escort to a true high-altitude fighter. Pilots reported that the plane could now climb faster, maintain speed above 20,000 feet, and, most crucially, escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. In effect, the Allison's failure at altitude had forced a solution that created one of the greatest fighter transformations of the war. Meanwhile, in the U.S., skepticism remained. The Army Air Forces had invested heavily in the P-47 and the P-38, and bureaucratic inertia slowed enthusiasm for yet another fighter type. But the British results were impossible to ignore. By 1943, the U.S. had begun producing the Packard-built version of the Merlin engine under license. These engines, designated V-1650, brought the same high-altitude performance to American-built Mustangs, ensuring mass production could support the bomber offensive. The first U.S. designation was P-51B, and it marked a turning point, not only for the Mustang but for the air war over Europe itself. Veteran pilots quickly noticed the difference. With the Allison, Mustangs had been fast and agile below 15,000 feet, but they were outclassed when climbing with Focke-Wulf 190s or Messerschmitt 109s higher up. With the Merlin, the tables turned. Suddenly, the Mustang could meet the German fighters head-on at their own altitude, sustain long-range escort missions, and still retain its nimble handling. It was, in many ways, the perfect fusion of American innovation in aerodynamics and British genius in engine design. For the pilots who had struggled with the limitations of the Allison, the transformation was nothing short of revolutionary. The consequences were immediate. By the end of 1943, bomber crews flying into Germany began to see a new kind of escort overhead, sleek, fast, and capable of sticking with them all the way. Morale rose, losses began to drop, and the myth of the invincible Luftwaffe fighter arm started to crack. All of this was rooted in one realization. The Allison problem had not been a flaw in the Mustang's design, but a mismatch between airframe and power plant. Once that mismatch was corrected, the aircraft became everything its designers had dreamed, and more. Even so, there's a deeper irony here. If the Allison had been good enough at altitude, perhaps the Mustang would have never evolved into the legend it became. The forced pairing with the Merlin not only saved the bomber offensive, it redefined what the Allies could achieve in the skies. From 1944 onward, the Mustang was no longer an underdog or an experimental project. It was the spearhead of Allied air power, born from a failure that demanded a bold solution. And for the men flying over occupied Europe, that solution meant the difference between life and death. By early 1944, the Merlin-powered Mustang was no longer a promising experiment. It was a frontline reality. But its impact on the war could only be understood in the context of the U.S. daylight bombing campaign, a strategy as daring as it was deadly. The idea was straightforward yet brutal. Smash Germany's industrial heart with relentless daytime raids, cripple the Luftwaffe on its own turf, and pave the way for an Allied invasion. In practice, however, it had been a slaughter. Before the Mustang's arrival, bomber formations flying into targets like Regensburg, Schweinfurt, or Bremen had faced catastrophic losses. The B-17s were called flying fortresses. But even a fortress couldn't stand against swarms of Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s once the limited escort fighters had turned back. Some missions lost 1 in 5 bombers. Crews would look at the empty bunks in their barracks each night and wonder if they would be next. This was the environment into which the Merlin Mustang entered combat. Suddenly, the calculus of the air war shifted. With its extraordinary range, over 1,500 miles with drop tanks, the P-51 could now accompany bombers from takeoff in England all the way to deep targets in Germany and back. This wasn't just a tactical adjustment. It was a strategic earthquake. For the first time, American bombers could count on cover throughout the mission, a fact that rattled the Luftwaffe leadership and began to sap the morale of their fighter pilots. The Mustang was not simply another escort, it was the long-sought shield for the bomber offensive. But its role went beyond defense. Fighter doctrine was evolving. Early escort orders had been rigid. Stay with the bombers. Pilots were frustrated, knowing they could see German fighters massing just beyond gun range, waiting to swoop in. In late 1943 and early 1944, General Jimmy Doolittle, then commander of the 8th Air Force, changed the rules. He gave the Mustang squadrons the freedom to range ahead of the bomber streams, hunting the Luftwaffe before they could strike. With speed, climb, and altitude performance on their side, Mustang pilots began aggressively sweeping the skies. German formations, once the hunters, now found themselves stalked. Suddenly, the attrition shifted. It was the Luftwaffe bleeding veteran pilots at a rate they could not sustain. The psychological impact was profound. For bomber crews, seeing the long-nosed P-51s sliding into position at their wings or darting ahead of the formation was an enormous relief. Little friends, they called them, a nickname spoken with genuine affection. For German pilots, however, the Mustang became a specter. The moment they thought they had calculated a safe approach or an ambush, a Mustang could appear out of the sun, diving with its .50 caliber machine guns blazing. Some Luftwaffe aces admitted later that by 1944, the Mustang was the plane they feared most. Not just because of its performance, but because of its numbers. Unlike the Luftwaffe, which was straining under Allied bombing of fuel and factories, the U.S. could build Mustangs in overwhelming quantities and train new pilots steadily. Combat reports from early 1944 paint a vivid picture. In raids over Leipzig, Mustang escorts tangled with dozens of German fighters, often breaking up attacks before they could reach the bomber boxes. On missions to Berlin, bomber crews described seeing dogfights stretching for miles, Mustangs dueling with Messerschmitts and rolling, twisting battles that often ended with black smoke trails plunging toward the ground. For the first time in years, the Luftwaffe was being challenged not only on equal terms but with superior endurance. A German pilot could win a dogfight, disengage, and climb, only to find that the Mustang could climb with him, chase him, and finish the fight. The Allison Mustang could never have done this. The Merlin Mustang made it possible. Yet, what often gets overlooked is just how much this transformation meant in human terms. The young bomber crews, many barely out of their teens, had been writing letters home with grim resignation, knowing each mission felt like rolling dice. The arrival of Mustangs changed that mood. Survival odds improved, confidence returned, and bomber missions became not just brutal tests of endurance but achievable objectives. Veterans later said that the sight of Mustangs overhead gave them something priceless. Hope. That hope translated into persistence, and persistence translated into pressure on Germany's war machine that could not be relieved. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe's decline accelerated. Fuel shortages grew worse as Allied bombers struck refineries, and training programs could no longer keep up with losses. Germany still produced formidable aircraft, later models of the FW-190, the Me-262 jet fighter, but by then the balance of the skies had shifted. The Mustang was not invincible, but it was relentless. Its combination of range, speed, altitude, and agility made it the right weapon at the right moment. Without it, the daylight bombing campaign might have collapsed under its own weight of casualties. With it, the strategy not only survived but succeeded. This success, however, carried an irony worth remembering. The Mustang that saved the bomber offensive was only possible because of the Allison problem. Without the Allison's high-altitude failure, there would have been no urgent push for the Merlin swap. Without British experimentation, the U.S. might have continued pouring resources into Thunderbolts and Lightnings alone. In that sense, the Mustang's triumph was born from its initial failure. History rarely gives us such clean cause and effect, but here the line is stark. The Allison Mustang was a disappointment, and because of that, the Merlin Mustang became a legend. By the summer of 1944, as Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, the Mustang was more than a fighter. It was a symbol of American reach and resolve. Overhead, squadrons of P-51s patrolled, ensuring that German reinforcements could not move freely, that Luftwaffe fighters dared not mass in force, and that the invasion skies belonged to the Allies. From that point forward, the Mustang was not just part of the story, it was inseparable from victory itself. By late 1944, the Mustang was no longer the newcomer. It was the backbone of Allied air superiority, the fighter that had tipped the scales in the deadliest air war of history. But to understand its final chapter in World War II, you have to appreciate how far it had come in such a short span. Just 2 years earlier, the Allison-powered Mustang had been dismissed as a low-altitude oddity, useful perhaps for reconnaissance but certainly not a war winner. Now, with the Merlin engine, it was escorting bombers to Berlin, sweeping the skies clear of German opposition, and shaping the outcome of the conflict itself. The story of the Mustang's Allison problem was no longer about failure. It had become the foundation of victory. As 1944 turned into 1945, the Allies were pressing deeper into occupied Europe. Bombing missions intensified, targeting not just factories and oil refineries, but also railways, bridges, and communication hubs. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was collapsing under the strain. Mustang squadrons were not merely escorting bombers anymore. They were ranging freely across German airspace, hunting down anything that moved. Trains, convoys, and airfields became fair game. Pilots called it fighter sweep or armed reconnaissance. But to the Germans, it was devastating. Even the vaunted Me-262 jet, Germany's last great technological hope, could not turn the tide. Jets were fast, yes, but they needed long runways, careful handling, and fuel that was increasingly scarce. Mustangs would often loiter near jet bases, pouncing on them during takeoff or landing when their speed advantage disappeared. The Allison Mustang could never have dreamed of such missions. The Merlin Mustang made them routine. For bomber crews, the shift was almost surreal. In 1943, missions to places like Schweinfurt had meant facing waves of German fighters with only limited escort protection. Loss rates of 20% or more were common. By early 1945, those same missions were covered end-to-end by Mustangs. Losses fell dramatically, and the 8th Air Force could finally deliver the sustained blows that crippled German industry beyond repair. Historians often credit the bombing campaign with hastening the end of the war in Europe, and without the Mustang, that campaign might have been abandoned altogether. But perhaps the most striking measure of the Mustang's impact was the toll it took on the Luftwaffe's pilot corps. German aces had once dominated the skies, men like Adolf Galland and Erich Hartmann racking up enormous kill counts. Yet by 1944-45, they were being forced into lopsided battles, outnumbered and outlasted. Hartmann himself admitted that the Mustang was the fighter he respected most. The Luftwaffe's younger pilots, rushed into combat with minimal training due to fuel shortages and Allied bombing of training facilities, stood little chance against seasoned Mustang squadrons. The Allison Mustang might have been a footnote in this story, The Merlin Mustang was the chapter that ended it. The Mustang's role did not end with the war in Europe. As the Pacific Campaign surged toward its climax, Mustangs were deployed to Iwo Jima, where they escorted B-29 superfortresses on the longest bombing missions of the war, raids over Japan itself. The distances were staggering, yet the P-51, with its drop tanks and efficient airframe, made the journey. For B-29 crews, seeing Mustangs over Tokyo was the same reassurance that B-17 crews had felt over Berlin. The little friends had followed the war all the way from the hedgerows of Normandy to the skies over the imperial capital. That was range and endurance no other fighter of the era could match. When the war ended in 1945, the Mustang stood as more than just another military tool. It had become an icon. Veterans remembered it not just for its performance but for its personality. The long nose, the howl of its supercharger intake, the way it seemed to dance through the air rather than brute force its way. Many insisted it was not just the best fighter of the war, but perhaps the best piston-engine fighter ever built. Museums today display them with pride, and airshows still roar with the sound of their Merlin engines, a living reminder of a time when the world's future hung in the balance and machines like this made all the difference. And yet, there's a poetic irony to close this story. The Mustang's glory was born from a problem. The Allison engine, competent at low altitudes but hopeless above 15,000 feet, nearly doomed the aircraft to obscurity. It was, in essence, a mismatch, a brilliant airframe paired with the wrong heart. If not for that flaw, the British might never have experimented with the Merlin swap. If not for the desperation of the bomber offensive, the U.S. might never have adopted it so widely. The Allison problem, which once seemed like the Mustang's death sentence, was in fact its salvation. Out of that failure came one of the greatest transformations in aviation history. For the men who flew it, the Mustang was more than metal and machinery. It was a lifeline, a partner, and a weapon that carried them through the fire of war. For the men who faced it, it was a symbol of inevitability, proof that the tide had turned, that the skies no longer belonged to Germany. For history, it remains a reminder that sometimes the greatest successes emerge not in spite of failure, but because of it. The first Mustang failed at high altitude, but in that failure lay the seed of greatness. And when it finally found the right engine, it did not just succeed, it helped win a world war.